Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at a topic that's been getting a lot of attention lately, restorative discipline.
Oh, yeah, restorative discipline.
Specifically, some of the pushback it's been receiving.
Yeah.
It seems like just a few years ago, everyone was so excited about it,
hmm
moving
Yeah.
away from punishments like suspensions and towards, this idea of repairing harm.
Right.
So why are we seeing this shift now? Why are some people starting to question restorative discipline?
Well, I think it's important to remember that education is full of these trends.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
A new approach comes along and everyone's like, this is it. This is going to solve all our
A
problems.
silver bullet.
Exactly.
Right.
But then, the reality of putting it into practice hits.
Yeah, it never seems to be quite as simple as,
Never.
as people hope.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing with restorative discipline.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more nuance to it than maybe we initially realized.
Yeah, for sure.
So today we're going to be looking at the arguments of Dr. Howie Knoff.
Okay.
He's a psychologist who's been pretty vocal in his criticisms of restorative discipline.
Interesting.
And his central argument is that the research just isn't there to support how widely it's been adopted.
I see.
A lot of people might hear that and think, wait a minute, I thought there was tons of research showing that restorative discipline works.
Right.
So that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
Yeah. What did he find?
Well, he starts by talking about how people tend to oversimplify complex issues.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's so tempting to look for easy answers, right? Like, okay, restorative discipline, that's the answer to all of our school discipline problems.
Right.
But human behavior is just way more complicated than that.
Of course.
And in fact, Dr. Knoff has identified what he calls 5 reasons why he thinks people jumped on the restorative discipline bandwagon maybe a little too quickly.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
All right, so the first reason he calls simplicity versus complexity. We as humans, we crave simple solutions.
We do.
Even when dealing with very complex problems. And then he has another reason that's kind of along those same lines.
Okay.
It's his second reason. He calls it supernatural versus scientific thinking.
Supernatural versus scientific thinking.
Yeah, essentially he's saying that some people seem to think restorative discipline is like this magic wand.
I see.
You just wave it and all the problems disappear.
Right.
Without any need for like hard evidence or a clear plan for how to actually implement it effectively.
Yeah. I mean, good intentions are great, but they only get you so far.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of ties into his fifth reason, which is social media versus social justice.
Okay, interesting.
It's amazing how social media can really amplify certain ideas.
Oh, for sure.
Even if those ideas haven't been fully vetted or researched.
Yeah. And with something as important as social justice, you really don't want to be jumping to conclusions.
Right. It's so easy to get caught up in the hype, especially when you see something being presented as this perfect solution to a complex problem. And I think this is where Dr. Knopf's third reason comes in.
Okay, what's that?
It's something he calls social psychology versus singular voices.
Okay.
Basically, he's saying that groupthink can be really powerful.
Yeah, it definitely can.
And it can make it hard for people to speak up, even when they have legitimate concerns.
Especially when something's really trendy.
Right, exactly. It's like everyone's afraid to be the one who says, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't actually as great as everyone's saying it is.
Yeah, it's that whole emperor's new clothes thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Nobody wants to be the one to point out that maybe the emperor isn't wearing any clothes.
Exactly.
So what's the fourth reason?
Oh, right. His fourth reason is what he calls self-protection versus self-evaluation.
Okay.
And this one is all about how sometimes it's easier to just point fingers
Easier than what?
than to actually look inward and examine our own biases or shortcomings.
Yeah, it's definitely easier to blame something or someone else than to admit that maybe we've made a mistake.
Right, and that's what can happen with these new trends in education. It's easy to get swept up in the enthusiasm and not really question whether it's the right fit for our own school or classroom.
It's easier to just say, well, this is the new thing, so we have to do it.
Right, and then if it doesn't work out, you can just say, well, it's the program's fault.
Yeah, you can shift the blame.
Exactly.
Okay, so Dr. Knoff has laid out these 5 reasons why he thinks restorative discipline maybe got a bit more hype than it deserved.
Right, but he also goes deeper into the research.
Oh, really? Let's hear it.
Yeah, he specifically critiques a study that was done by Wested.
Okay.
And this study was often cited as proof that restorative practices were effective.
Interesting. So what was wrong with it?
Well, Dr. Knoff points out that the study relied heavily on student perceptions
Oh,
instead of actual objective data.
like asking students if they thought things were better.
Exactly. It's kind of like asking someone, are you a good driver?
Haha. Yeah.
Most people can say, yeah, of course I am.
Right. But their driving record might tell a different story.
Exactly. So just because students say they think things are better
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that their behavior has actually changed.
It's a really good point.
And it's even more interesting.
What's that?
Even Wested themselves admitted that their study had some limitations.
Oh, they did.
Yeah, they couldn't definitively say that restorative practices were the cause of any positive outcomes.
Oh, wow.
That's a pretty big caveat.
It is.
So, I think this highlights how important it is to be critical of research.
Yeah, for sure.
You can't just take it at face value just because it supports what you want to believe.
Absolutely. You got to look at the methodology, the limitations, the whole picture.
Right. Because sometimes those headlines can be really misleading.
Yeah, sometimes they are.
Okay, so we've talked about the Wested study,
Mm-hmm.
but what about, the Pittsburgh study?
Oh, yeah, the big one.
That's considered like the gold standard of research on restorative discipline.
Right. A lot of people point to that study.
Yeah. And initially, it did show some promising results.
Like what?
Well, the schools that were using restorative practices, they saw a reduction in suspensions.
Okay, that's good.
And they also saw a narrowing of the racial disparities
Oh, that's even better.
in terms of who was getting disciplined.
Yeah, that's really important.
So on the surface, it sounds like a win-win, right?
It does.
But this is where it gets really interesting.
Knew it.
You know me too well.
Okay, spill the tea. What's so interesting?
Well, it turns out that suspensions also decreased in the control group schools,
In the control group.
meaning the schools that weren't even using restorative practices.
Huh. So it wasn't just the restorative practices that were causing the decrease.
Exactly. There must have been other factors at play.
Yeah, like what? Do they know?
Well, that's something that researchers are still trying to figure out.
Okay, makes sense.
But that's not the only interesting finding.
Well, there's more.
Oh, yeah. So remember how I said the Pittsburgh study showed positive results?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out that those positive effects were mainly seen in elementary schools,
Okay.
not middle schoolers.
Interesting. So restorative practices might be more effective for younger students.
That's what it seems like.
Hmm.
Wonder why.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, so what happened in middle schools?
Well, there was no improvement in academic outcomes.
None at all.
Nope. And on some measures, academic performance actually got a little bit worse.
Oh, wow, that's not what you want to see.
Right. And then to make things even more complicated,
Oh,
data from the years after the study suggests that schools might have been underreporting disciplinary actions.
underreporting.
Yeah, and that suspension rates might have started creeping back up.
Oh, so maybe the initial decrease wasn't as significant as it seemed?
Right.
So it's like the positive effects were kind of fading over time?
Exactly.
Okay, so this is all pretty complex,
It is.
but I think it's really important to be having these conversations.
Well, we need to be willing to look at the research critically and not just accept things at face value.
Especially when it comes to something as important as education.
Right, because ultimately what we're talking about here is kids.
And their futures.
Exactly.
So we can't afford to just jump on the latest bandwagon.
Nope.
We need to be thoughtful and discerning.
And make sure that the approaches we're using are actually backed by evidence.
And that they're actually benefiting our students.
Right. And I think this is where the conversation gets even more interesting.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, if restorative discipline isn't the silver bullet, then what is?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we're going to be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. Welcome back. So we've been talking about restorative discipline.
Yeah, kind of unpacking some of the criticisms that Dr. Knoff has raised.
Yeah, it's interesting because while he brings up some really valid points, I think it's important to remember that there are also a lot of educators out there who have seen positive results with restorative practices.
Yeah, you can't just dismiss their experiences.
Right, exactly.
But at the same time, we can't ignore the potential downsides and the need for stronger evidence.
Absolutely. It's about being thoughtful and discerning.
Yeah, and maybe, moving away from this idea that restorative discipline is like the solution.
Right. It's not a magic wand.
So if we're not just focusing on reducing suspensions, then what should our goals be? Like, what are we ultimately trying to achieve?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think ultimately what we want for our students is for them to feel safe and respected in school. We want them to develop strong social and emotional skills so they can navigate conflicts peacefully, build healthy relationships. And of course, we want them to be successful academically.
Of course.
So those are the kind of outcomes that we should be striving for.
Yeah, those are great goals, but they seem so broad.
They are.
Like, how do you actually measure something like social and emotional well-being?
Right. It's definitely more nuanced than just counting suspensions or looking at grades.
Right.
But there are ways to gather meaningful data.
Okay, like what?
Well, you can use surveys to get student perspectives on school climate, how connected they feel to their teachers and peers.
Okay.
You can observe classroom interactions, see how students are resolving conflicts, supporting each other, and you can look at student work for signs of creativity, critical thinking, collaboration.
So it's about taking this like more holistic view,
Exactly.
using a variety of tools to really understand how students are doing.
Right. And data isn't just for researchers or administrators.
Okay.
Teachers can use data to reflect on their own practices, identify areas for growth, tailor their instruction to meet the diverse needs of their students.
Okay, so we've talked about goals, we've talked about data, but I think the big question now is if we're shifting away from this narrow focus on punishment,
Right.
and towards this more holistic approach, what does that actually mean for how schools operate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it requires some pretty fundamental changes.
Like what?
Well, one key shift is moving away from reactive approaches,
Okay.
where we're constantly putting out fires,
Yeah.
and towards proactive strategies that focus on prevention and early intervention.
So instead of just dealing with problems after they happen,
Right.
we're trying to create environments where those problems are less likely to occur in the first place.
Exactly.
I like that. Okay, but how do we actually do that? Like, what are some specific strategies that schools can use?
Well, one approach that's gained a lot of traction is something called positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS for short.
PBIS. Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a framework that helps schools create systems for defining teaching and reinforcing positive behaviors.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that look like in practice?
So imagine a school where everyone, students, teachers, staff, are all on the same page about what respectful and responsible behavior looks like.
Okay.
The expectations are clearly defined, taught, explicitly and consistently reinforced. There are systems in place to recognize and reward students for making positive choices.
So it's not about being permissive or letting things slide.
No, not at all.
It's about setting clear boundaries and creating this culture of positive reinforcement.
Exactly. And there's a growing body of research showing that PBIS can be very effective.
Oh, really? In what ways?
Well, it can reduce disciplinary referrals, improve school climate, increase academic engagement.
Wow, that's great. Are there other proactive approaches that schools can use?
Absolutely. Another key area is social emotional learning, or SEL.
SEL, okay.
This is about helping students develop skills like self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making.
Okay, so basically giving students the tools they need to manage their emotions, build healthy relationships, make good choices. Okay, that sounds crucial. But how do you teach something like self-awareness?
Right. It's not like teaching math facts or grammar rules.
Right.
It's about creating opportunities for students to reflect on their feelings, identify their strengths and challenges, learn strategies for managing stress and conflict.
Okay, so incorporating these skills into the curriculum and giving students real-world opportunities to practice them.
Exactly. And it's not just about teaching students. It's about creating a school environment that supports social and emotional development.
Okay.
This includes things like having regular class meetings where students can share their feelings and concerns.
Okay.
Using restorative conversations to help students repair harm and rebuild relationships after conflicts. Providing access to mental health professionals and other support services.
Okay, so this all sounds great in theory, but I'm wondering how it plays out in real schools.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of schools that are successfully using these proactive approaches?
Oh, absolutely. There are many inspiring examples.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there's a school in California that implemented a comprehensive SEL program and saw amazing results.
Okay.
Disciplinary referrals went down, academic achievement improved, and students were more engaged in learning.
Wow. Okay. What did they do specifically?
Well, they started by providing professional development for their teachers on SEL principles and strategies.
Okay.
Then they made SEL a part of their curriculum with dedicated time for lessons and activities that focused on developing students' social and emotional skills.
Okay.
And they didn't stop there. They also created school-wide practices like morning meetings and community circles to foster a sense of connection and belonging.
So they took a very intentional and multifaceted approach,
They did.
involving the entire school community.
Yes, and the results speak for themselves. This school is proof that investing in proactive strategies can create a ripple effect of positive change.
That's powerful. Are there other examples you can share?
Sure, there's a middle school in Massachusetts that took a really interesting approach with PBIS.
Okay.
They put a strong emphasis on student voice and leadership.
Okay.
They created a student-led behavior committee that was responsible for developing school-wide expectations, planning recognition events, promoting positive behavior.
Wow. So they really empowered students to take ownership of their school climate?
Exactly, and it worked. They saw fewer disciplinary referrals, better attendance, stronger relationships between students and teachers.
That's amazing.
These are just two examples, but there are many other schools across the country that are challenging the traditional ways of thinking about discipline and creating learning environments where all students can thrive.
It's inspiring to hear about these successes. It shows that real change is possible.
It does.
But I imagine this kind of shift takes a lot of work and dedication.
It does. It requires a willingness to challenge the status quo, to invest in professional development, and to collaborate across the entire school community.
So it's not a quick fix.
No.
It's a long-term commitment to changing how we approach student behavior and create supportive learning environments.
Exactly, and it's a journey worth taking.
I agree. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on a crucial question.
Okay.
If we're moving away from simply reducing suspensions as the ultimate measure of success, then what should we be focusing on instead?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? If we're not just aiming for fewer suspensions, what does success actually look like?
Right. It's a really good question. And I think it's easy to get so caught up in the numbers, but we have to remember that we're talking about real kids.
Yeah, each with their own unique needs and experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if we're moving beyond just looking at discipline data, we need to consider a wider range of outcomes that really reflect how students are actually doing, academically, socially, emotionally.
Okay, so more than just grades and test scores.
Right, exactly.
What are some of those other indicators of success? Like what should schools be paying attention to?
Well, I think for starters, think about the skills that will help students thrive not just in school, but in life. Things like critical thinking, problem-solving, collaboration, communication.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of abilities that employers are looking for and that will help young people navigate the complexities of the world.
Absolutely. Those are important skills, but how do we measure those things?
Right.
It seems a lot more challenging than just, tracking attendance or disciplinary actions.
It's definitely more nuanced, but there are ways to gather meaningful data.
Okay, how?
Well, think about it. If you want to know how well a student can collaborate, you can observe them working in groups, look at projects they've completed together, or even ask their peers for feedback.
Okay.
So it's about using a variety of methods.
To get a more well-rounded picture
Exactly.
of how students are progressing.
And we can use surveys to get students' perspectives on their learning experiences,
Okay.
how connected they feel to school. We can look at student work samples to see how they're applying their knowledge and skills in creative ways.
Yeah.
And we can even talk to students directly, in individual interviews or focus groups to get their insights and feedback.
So really kind of shifting our thinking about assessment.
Right, moving away from this one-size-fits-all approach
Yeah.
and really embracing a more personalized view of assessment.
Okay.
And here's a really important point. Students shouldn't just be passive recipients of this assessment.
Okay.
We should be involving them in the process, asking for their input on what they value and how they experience school.
Yeah, because ultimately they're the ones that we're trying to serve, right?
Exactly. Their voices and perspectives are essential.
Okay, so if we're shifting our focus to these, broader measures of success, it sounds like it's going to require some pretty big changes in how schools operate.
You're right. It's not just about tweaking a few policies or adding a new program.
Right.
It's about changing the culture of schools and how we think about student behavior.
Yeah.
If we're truly prioritizing things like social emotional learning and student well-being, that's going to impact everything from how teachers are trained to how resources are allocated.
Yeah, it's not just like sprinkling in a few SEL lessons here and there.
Right. It's a fundamental shift.
Yeah, in mindset and practice.
And it's about creating a school culture that values the whole child,
Yeah.
not just their academic performance.
So schools would need to invest in professional development for teachers
Absolutely.
on topics like trauma-informed practices and culturally responsive teaching and strategies for creating, inclusive and equitable learning environments.
Right. It's a big undertaking, but it's essential.
Yeah, I mean, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of this issue.
Me too.
We've learned about the limitations of relying solely on restorative discipline,
Mm-hmm.
explored some promising alternative approaches,
Yeah.
and started to think about, what success might look like in a more holistic and student-centered education system.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
And I hope it encourages our listeners to continue exploring these issues,
Yeah.
asking tough questions and advocating for educational practices that truly serve the needs of all students.
I agree. And if you're interested in learning more about the topics we discussed today, we'll be sure to include some links to resources in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely check those out.
And we'd also love to hear your thoughts and reflections on this episode.
Mm-hmm.
You can find us on social media or email us directly.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make a difference in the lives of young people.